have no credibility and I have no pull. We're trying to make a classic comedy.
There are some very dark theories surrounding Ellen DeGeneres that brought up a lot of speculation.
This conversation was supposed to last an hour. Instead, it detonated across Hollywood. Katt Williams walked into that studio without a script, started talking, and within days, the interview had racked up tens of millions of views. Suddenly, old rumors were being dragged back into the spotlight, famous names were being questioned, and one comedian's reputation was taking a very different shape. But Katt wasn't just making accusations, he claimed he knew things most people had never heard. So, what was he really trying to expose? And why did Ellen spend years pushing back against the story? Join us as we uncover what Katt Williams has to say about Ellen DeGeneres. One Night, Two Reckonings. On January 3rd, 2024, a small podcast studio in Atlanta filled with cigar smoke as Katt Williams sat down for what was supposed to be a routine hour-long conversation. The guest was Micah Williams, the comedian the world knew as Katt Williams. The host was Shannon Sharpe, a retired NFL tight end who had turned his show, Club Shay Shay, into one of the only rooms in entertainment where celebrities actually dropped their guard. Katt sat down and made it clear early that he hadn't come to promote anything. He'd come to settle scores, and he wasn't interested in leaving any of them unfinished. Shannon didn't know it yet, but he was about to lose control of his own show. The hour he'd planned stretched past 2, then close to 3, as Katt worked through a list of grievances against nearly every major name in black comedy. He wasn't venting, he was building a case, one name at a time, laying out claims that would take other people months to even begin answering. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, it was already the longest episode Club Shay Shay had ever posted. Within a week, it became the most watched interview in YouTube's history, and the number kept climbing long after that. Nobody in that studio could have guessed that, thousands of miles away, a completely different kind of reckoning was already winding down. Ellen DeGeneres hadn't sat for a bombshell interview of her own. She'd simply stopped being asked to sit for anything at all. Her daytime talk show had gone off the air 2 years earlier, in May of 2022, closing out 19 seasons and more than 3,000 episodes with none of the fanfare that usually follows a run that long.
After more than 3,000 episodes and 2,400 celebrity interviews, that's a wrap for the Ellen DeGeneres show.
There was no farewell tour, just an ending that was years overdue for a brand that had been coming apart in slow motion since the summer of 2020. For nearly 2 decades, Ellen had sold America on a single word, kind. It was stitched into her set design, printed across her merchandise, repeated in almost every monologue she gave. Katt had built much of his reputation on the opposite instinct, saying things other comedians might have kept to themselves, even when doing so came at a cost. For most of those 30 years, the industry rewarded exactly one of those approaches. Ellen walked away with the Presidential Medal of Freedom and a media empire worth hundreds of millions.
Ellen DeGeneres has lifted our spirits and brought joy to our lives as a stand-up comic, actor, and television star.
While Katt walked away with blacklisted rooms and a reputation as the guy nobody wanted seated 2 chairs down at an industry dinner. By January 2024, that math was already starting to flip, and almost nobody had noticed yet. The same month, Katt's interview was exploding online. Ellen was still dealing with the fallout from the workplace scandal that had damaged her career 4 years earlier. 2 people in the same industry, appearing to represent 2 completely different approaches to fame. Katt built his reputation on saying what others wouldn't, while Ellen built hers around being relentlessly positive. Neither of them had any idea that the next 12 months would answer that question in full, and not in the order anyone watching in 2019 would have predicted. To understand why Ellen's image eventually collapsed, we have to go back to the 19 years she spent building it. 19 years of nice. Ellen didn't start out as an institution. In the early 1980s, she was working small stand-up clubs, telling jokes to rooms that were sometimes half empty, until a 1986 spot on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson turned her into a name people actually recognized. A couple of sitcoms followed, and by 2003 she had her own daytime talk show carrying her name in the title. which meant every decision made on that stage was, on paper, hers alone to make. The show worked because Ellen made it look effortless, dancing through commercial breaks, giving away cars and college tuition to strangers pulled from the audience, turning being nice into a personality, then a brand, then an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For almost 2 decades, the woman on screen became almost inseparable from the image she had built around kindness. Then came the summer of 2020. Reporters started hearing from current and former staff, and what those employees described didn't sound anything like the show the country had been watching for 17 years. One employee said she was let go shortly after taking medical leave. Others said they'd lost their jobs after taking bereavement days to attend family funerals. A black staffer described a producer who made a comment about mixing her up with another black employee because they both wore box braids, and said it was one of several moments that left her feeling she had no real way to push back. Multiple people who worked there said their own managers had told them, explicitly, not to speak to Ellen directly if they happened to pass her in a hallway, as if the woman whose name was on the building needed protecting from the very people keeping it running. The reporting did not establish that Ellen personally carried out the specific acts described by the employees, but the show bore her name, making the allegations inseparable from the image she had built. Other people who'd worked around her started speaking up, too. The comedian Brad Garrett, who had appeared on the show several times over the years, agreed publicly that the warmth on camera never matched what he'd heard happen once the lights went down. The actress Leah Thompson backed him up in 2 words that needed no follow-up. Ellen tried to handle it the way she'd handled everything else for 19 years, out loud, from her own stage. She sent a letter to her staff, taking responsibility for what had happened under her name. Weeks later, she opened her next season by addressing it directly, telling her audience she was disappointed to learn what had apparently been going on behind the scenes. But it didn't work. Warner Bros. Launched an internal investigation. The investigation was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Warner Bros. Interviewed roughly 100 people connected to the show. The review did not find a culture of racism, but it did uncover problems that the company said needed to be addressed. 3 senior producers, Ed Glavin, Kevin Lemon, and Jonathan Norman, were subsequently removed from the show. The show limped through 2 more seasons anyway. Then in 2021, Ellen announced it would end, insisting she'd first learned about the allegations from the press, the same way everyone else had, and that she'd never seen a single sign of it happening under her own roof. By May of 2022, after 19 years and more than 3,000 episodes, the cameras stopped rolling for good. What made the fall land so hard wasn't just the allegations themselves. It was the distance between the brand and the story sitting underneath it. A comedian can survive being called mean, but a woman who spent 19 years selling an entire identity around one specific word can't survive being accused of the opposite. Not with that audience. Not after many years of hearing the same promise on a loop. By the time Katt sat down with Shannon in January 2024, Ellen's show was already gone, and she was left trying to rebuild a career after the controversy had fundamentally changed how the industry viewed her. But while Ellen's story was winding down, Katt's was only beginning to explode. The man Hollywood couldn't fix. Katt never had the kind of carefully managed public image that defined Ellen's career. For decades, he had built his reputation on saying whatever he thought, regardless of who was listening. It made him plenty of enemies and even more fans, usually in that order. That habit followed him off stage too, and it kept landing him in real trouble. In 2016, he pleaded no contest to assault and battery charges in Georgia after an altercation with a bodyguard, and walked away with 5 years of probation. That same year, police in Seattle arrested him after a dispute at a bar spiraled into accusations that he'd threatened a manager with a pool cue and flicked a lit cigarette at a woman through a car window. 2 years later, he was arrested again in Portland, this time over an alleged fight with a driver he'd hired to take him and his dog from the airport. None of that made Katt easy to defend. His arrests and public controversies also became part of a reputation that made him harder for Hollywood to market, and his mainstream opportunities became less consistent. Every bridge he'd already burned by refusing to soften an opinion about another comedian stayed burned permanently. while Kevin Hart and Steve Harvey built increasingly mainstream, family-friendly empires around themselves, Katt built a reputation as the guy who made green rooms go quiet, because there was no telling what he might say about the person standing 3 feet away, or how loudly he might say it. What rarely made it into any of those stories was why he kept doing it anyway. Katt moved out of his family's home at 13 and spent a stretch of his early life without anywhere stable to sleep, before stand-up gave him a way out. His early struggles also shaped the way he talked about success, especially his suspicion of people he believed had not earned what they claimed to have earned. Where most comedians learn to smile through disagreements to keep the industry's doors open, Katt refused to perform that smile, no matter what it cost him. For most of his career, it cost him plenty. He also spent years accusing other comedians of copying his material or exaggerating their own hardships, while watching some of those same comedians land bigger movie deals and more mainstream opportunities. Meanwhile, every arrest, every outburst, every unfiltered opinion got filed away as further proof that Katt Williams simply couldn't be trusted, on stage or off it. Then, slowly, the way some people viewed Katt began to change. As more Hollywood scandals exposed problems behind carefully managed public images, his supporters started seeing his willingness to speak openly in a different light. What they had once dismissed as instability now looked to them like a refusal to stay quiet. By January 2024, Katt had spent decades building a reputation for saying things other comedians would usually leave unsaid. Club Shay Shay simply gave that reputation a much larger audience. The arrests and burned bridges were still part of his history. But after years of Hollywood scandals, some audiences had started questioning whether Katt's reputation for being difficult had obscured something more complicated. Then Katt sat down with Shannon Sharpe, and for nearly 3 hours, he named the people he believed had wronged him. 3 hours nobody walked away from. Once Katt started talking, Shannon faced a decision no interviewer wants to make live, with cameras rolling and no way to take it back. He could steer the conversation toward safer ground, or he could let his guest keep going and see where it landed. He chose to let it ride, a call he'd later admit he made in a split second, with no real plan for what came after. What came next was a string of accusations delivered calmly, one name at a time. Katt claimed Cedric the Entertainer had watched him perform his best closing joke live at the Comedy Store back in 1998, praised it to his face, and then used a version of that same joke years later as his own closer on the original Kings of Comedy. He accused Steve Harvey of lifting the entire concept behind his sitcom from a show hosted by comedian Mark Curry years earlier, and of turning his back on the late Bernie Mac while Bernie was still alive and struggling within their own circle.
Steve that went to go watch Mark Curry do his whole sitcom and then stole everything Mark Curry had.
He accused Kevin Hart of never really earning the industry's biggest opportunities, claiming Kevin had arrived in Hollywood with movie deals already lined up before he'd built any real audience of his own. Cedric didn't escape the same segment untouched either. Katt mocked his physical appearance outright, comparing him to a walrus, and then went after his output directly, telling him he hadn't put out a real special in years and that nothing he'd made lately was even worth watching, on Netflix, Tubi, or anywhere else. He took a shot at Chris Tucker's long disappearance from the Friday franchise too, and even turned on Shannon himself mid-interview, telling his own host that his loyalty to some of these men didn't add up. The fallout started before the interview even finished uploading. Cedric went online almost immediately and rejected the story outright, calling it revisionist history and pointing to more than 40 films across 4 decades of work that he said spoke for themselves, no single joke required. Steve did not address the accusations publicly until months later, when he rejected Katt's version of events and defended his relationship with Bernie Mac. He described his bond with Bernie as untouchable, the kind of friendship nobody in their right mind would have questioned while Bernie was alive, to defend it himself. Kevin took a shorter approach, calling the comments unfortunate and declining to spend much time addressing them publicly. But the interview wasn't only about the men Katt believed had wronged him. He also spent hours explaining the system he believed had allowed those men to rise while others were pushed aside. He talked about the politics of black comedy, the difference between being talented and being connected, and why he believes some comedians had been given opportunities before they had actually earned them. He also talked about his own beginnings, including leaving home at 13, spending time homeless, and struggling to finance his early career. That changed the shape of the conversation. Katt wasn't simply saying, "These people are fake." He was arguing that the entire system around black comedy had become distorted, and that the people who controlled access to movies, television, and major comedy tours had too much power over who got to move forward. Whether every accusation was true was another question, but the argument itself gave viewers something bigger to debate than one comedian's old grudges. What made the interview different was how quickly the conversation moved beyond celebrity gossip. Millions of viewers began debating Katt's accusations, the unwritten rules of the comedy business, and whether some of the people he criticized had benefited from those rules. Katt walked out of that studio having said things that would have ended most careers on the spot. Instead, something almost backward happened. He didn't appear to suffer the career collapse many expected. Instead, the interview gave him something he had rarely had at that scale: an audience willing to take his accusations seriously, even when the people he named disputed them. At around 80 million views, the conversation had clearly changed, and the numbers tell part of the story. The interview didn't stay inside the podcast's existing audience. Shannon's team broke the nearly 3-hour conversation into shorter clips, giving each accusation a second life on social media. Google's 2024 Culture and Trends report later counted more than 83 million views for the episode, making it one of the defining video podcast moments of the year. What started as one long conversation had effectively become dozens of separate pieces of content, each one capable of generating its own argument. Instead of focusing solely on Katt's reputation, millions of viewers debated whether any of his accusations were true. They were asking whether other people in comedy had been hiding uncomfortable truths of their own. But an interview built entirely to settle scores raises an obvious question, and it took almost a full year to get an honest answer. Was any of this actually about the truth, or was it 30 years of resentment finally finding a microphone loud enough to carry it? Katt wouldn't dodge that question forever. Months later, Katt gave an answer that complicated the story even more. What they finally admitted. September 2024, Ellen returned to the screen with her Netflix comedy special, For Your Approval. She could have easily avoided the subject entirely and built an hour out of safer material: aging, marriage, life after fame. Instead, she addressed the controversy directly, reflecting on what the backlash had done to her career and how she had dealt with the fallout. She didn't deny that her show had ended the way it did. She described what the fallout had cost her personally and credited her wife, Portia de Rossi, with keeping her steady through the worst stretch of it. Around that same period, in smaller stand-up rooms, she'd started describing the ending in blunter terms, joking that she'd essentially been pushed out of show business for being mean, and admitting she'd never gone to business school and never really knew how to run a company the size hers had become. Ellen eventually pushed back harder. In a 2021 interview with Savannah Guthrie, she said she still didn't understand how the allegations had grown so large, and described the entire situation as orchestrated and coordinated. She wasn't admitting that the accusations were false, but she was challenging the story that had formed around her and arguing that the public version of what happened had become something larger than what she believed was actually taking place inside the show. It wasn't a full confession, and it wasn't a total denial either. It was neither a full admission nor a complete rejection of the controversy, and by then the damage to her public image was already difficult to reverse. Katt's version of a final word came a few months later, and it landed very differently. Months later, Katt addressed the interview again and explained that he had gone into Club Shay Shay with the intention of damaging the careers of some of the people he planned to discuss. Whether Club Shay Shay had really been about the truth, or whether it had simply been 30 years of professional resentment finally boiling over in front of a camera. He didn't dodge it, telling New York Magazine's Vulture Festival, going further than almost anyone expected, admitting flat out that he had walked into that studio with the specific goal of ending certain careers, and that what actually aired had been the softened version. He said he'd originally written it to be far more damaging, then cut what he called the real knockout blows before the cameras even started rolling, leaving only the jabs behind. That admission complicated the image that had formed around the interview. Katt may have believed his accusations were justified, but he also acknowledged that he had entered the room with the intention of causing professional damage. Shannon, for his part, admitted in that same stretch of coverage that he never saw any of it coming, and that letting Katt keep talking that night had been a split-second decision he made with no idea it would end up defining an entire year of his show. Months apart, both Ellen and Katt were given opportunities to revisit the controversies surrounding them. Ellen focused on the personal cost of the backlash, while Katt continued to defend his decision to speak openly, even after admitting that he had planned to damage careers. Neither of them asked for forgiveness, and neither of them got it cleanly. By the time the Netflix special aired, much of the public debate around Ellen had already taken place. Katt's audience made up their minds the moment his interview crossed 60 million views and kept climbing from there. Their stories ultimately landed in very different places. Ellen's public image was permanently changed by the workplace controversy, while Katt's Club Shay Shay interview gave him new levels of attention, even as his later admission complicated his role in the story. Katt admitted he walked in planning to damage careers, then chose to hold back some of what he had prepared. So how should that change the way we judge everything he said that night? If Ellen spent 4 years defending herself against the allegations and later described the media coverage as orchestrated, was she explaining what happened or trying to regain control of the story? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.